Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5, unboxing and 100-point review. I had given up on getting a 5-string bass, at least it was on the back burner. The pit gig I quote-unquote needed it for is done, and I got by fine with a 4-string. The recent 5-strings I had tried left me so disillusioned that I just figured it wasn't worth it. But then, Fender announced this, the Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5. It's got perloid block inlays, cream neck binding, noiseless pickups, a high-mass bridge, and a 9-volt active preamp with stacked bass and treble boost knobs, and, critically for me, an active-passive toggle switch. There are a couple of things about this design that are on my deal breakers list. So it's going to be the ultimate test of whether or not those are really deal breakers. It has a gloss finish on the back of the neck, and the battery compartment has a screw-on cover. No quick battery swaps here. As far as the neck finish goes, I've come to realize over the past few years, trying a lot of different basses, that satin or gloss finish is a gross oversimplification. And as for the battery cover, well, that's where the active-passive switch comes in. A dead battery on stage doesn't turn this bass into an 11-pound boat anchor. Yes, this bass weighs 10.8 pounds. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's talk about how I got here. You can skip ahead to the next chapter if you, for some crazy reason, aren't fascinated by my personal stories. How did I get here? I have a complicated history with 5-string basses. I've been playing bass since 1990, and I got my first 5-string about 10 years later. It was a Fender American Standard in aquamarine metallic. It was my main bass for 3 years, until I replaced it with an Ernie Ball Music Man Stingray 5 in translucent orange. Now that was a heavy bass, about 13 pounds. I held on to that Music Man for about 6 years, at a time when I had young kids and really wasn't performing at all, and I decided my home recordings would be better served by selling that bass and replacing it with a cheaper bass and an electric guitar. That's how I ended up with a made-in-Mexico Fender Standard Jazz Bass 5. That bass, honestly, was kind of a piece of junk, and it soured me on Mexican-made Fenders for years. Flash forward to 2018. I was gigging again, and I decided to refresh my gear. I sold both the Jazz Bass 5 and my made-in-Japan Jaguar bass, and replaced them with a Fender American Professional P bass, along with a pair of Squier Vintage Modified Jazz basses, a fretless and a 5-string. That Squier Vintage Modified Jazz Bass 5 was a really great instrument. It was considerably better than the Fender I sold. The only thing I didn't like about it was the Jazz Bass decal on the headstock. The letters had been applied in a really weird way that looked like a mistake. I ended up selling that Squier a couple of years ago in the Great Purge during the grieving process of losing both of my parents in an 11-month period. I'm not trying to turn this into a downer. I just need to understand myself why I sold all 4 of the basses I owned in 2023, even though I liked all of them. But that's also what started me on the path to this series of videos. I went for a while without a 5-string after that, although I started to see scenarios where I would benefit from owning one. Since then, I've tried a Yamaha BB435, a Fender Player Plus Jazz Bass 5, a Sire Marcus Miller V5, and a Sadowski Metro Express hybrid 5-string. They all had problems I simply could not live with, and I ended up returning all 4 of them. Honestly, I'm surprised Sweetwater hasn't banned me by this point. And that brings us to the Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5. Is this the one? After my series of 5-string foibles in the past year, I had pretty much given up. But I'm always perusing Fender's website just to see what's new, and about a month ago I spotted this addition to the Squier lineup, the Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5. I already listed off some of the great features of this bass, the things that made me want to give a 5-string another chance. When they first appeared on Fender's website, they were listed at $529.99. So far, they've never been available from other retailers like Sweetwater, Guitar Center, or Chicago Music Exchange. Those websites are now saying December or January delivery and pricing the bass at $556.99. The 5% increase consistent with all of Fender's tariff-related price hikes I mentioned in an earlier video. I had been planning to order this bass in Sienna Sunburst as soon as Sweetwater had it available. But then I noticed that Fender themselves had the Ocean Turquoise model in stock, still at the $529.99 price. I put it in my cart, slept on it, and the next day pulled the trigger. About an hour later, I checked back, and Fender's website was showing it as out of stock. And within a day or so, Fender was also showing the price as $556.99. Did I get the last one Fender had in stock? Did I get the only one Fender had in stock? I think the answer to the former question, at least, is yes. It's a bit of a risk ordering a new instrument from very early in the production run, but I just had to give it a try. The big question is, will this finally be the 5-string bass I can live with? For a while at least? I'll get to the review in a minute, but first I want to talk about Squier versus Fender. Classic Vibe is the current top-end Squier line, made in Indonesia, just like this year's new entry-level Fender Standard Series. $600 appears to be the dividing line. Squier pushes right up against that point, and when you cross it, the Fender decal magically appears on the headstock. But as many others here on YouTube have noted, if you compare specs between Squier Classic Vibe and Fender Standard, Squier gives you a lot more bang for your buck. It's possible they're cutting corners on things like the tuners, fret wire, potentiometers, etc. with the Squiers, but it's really hard to know for sure. Let's just compare the specs of the 4-string Squier Classic Vibe 70s active jazz bass, currently selling for $524.99, against the Fender Standard Jazz bass, listed at $629.99. What does the Fender give you for that extra $105, and what does it take away? First, the colors. My old Fender American Standard 5-string was aquamarine metallic, and I remember it being turquoise. The color they're calling aquamarine metallic for the new Fender Standard Series almost looks like Lake Placid blue to me. The ocean turquoise of the Squier is how I remember my old Fender looking. Okay, digging into the specs, who wins? Accessories. Neither instrument comes with a case or gig bag. Not surprising, but my first bass in 1990 was the then made in Mexico Fender Standard, and it came with a hardshell case. For these instruments, it's a tie. Body. Both are poplar with gloss poly finish. Another tie. Electronics. The Fender comes with standard single coil pickups. The Squier has noiseless pickups. Sometimes noiseless pickups lose a bit of that distinctive jazz bass growl. I definitely found that with the Fender American Ultra I briefly owned a couple of years ago. We'll get into that more in the full review. But even if they have a less distinctive tone, I'll always pick noiseless pickups if I have the opportunity. And of course, we also have active tone shaping on the Squier. Advantage Squier. General. Nothing distinctive here besides color options. That's a purely aesthetic choice, so I'm going to have to call it another tie. Hardware. There might be differences in quality here, and since I haven't played the Fender Standard, I can't speak to that. But purely on spec, the main distinctions here are the high mass bridge and nickel finish on the Squier. Do you prefer nickel over chrome? I do, but again, that's an aesthetic choice. Still, the high mass bridge gives Squier the advantage here. Measurements. Honestly, I don't have a strong preference on fret wire. Narrow tall versus medium jumbo? Yes. It's a wash as far as I'm concerned. Miscellaneous. Why is this even here? Neck. Most of the specs here are identical. Two distinct differences. The Squier has a gloss finish on the back of the neck, whereas the Fender has a satin finish. Also, the Squier has a bone nut, and the Fender has micarta, a synthetic fiberglass material. It's commonly used for guitar and bass nuts, but often called synthetic bone. I don't really care much about the distinction between micarta and natural bone, although I suppose if I were a committed vegan, which I'm not, it might matter. I do strongly prefer a satin finish on the neck though, so I'm giving this one to Fender. Highlights. Well, the Squier has 6 features Fender finds worth highlighting with detail photos, but the Fender Standard only has 3. And are they even highlights? You be the judge. But the Squier has several distinctive upgrades that improve not just the playability and sound of the instrument, but also the aesthetics. What's my conclusion here? The Squier offers a ton of features the Fender, which again costs $105 more, doesn't. They're both manufactured in the same country, possibly in the same factory. The only thing Fender offers that I prefer over the Squier is the satin finish on the neck, which, to be fair, is a really important feature. Oh, and of course, there's a different decal on the headstock. The choice for me was not really a choice at all, though. I don't need another 4-string Fender bass. I did want a 5-string, though. The cheapest 5-string Fender on their website is the Player Plus Active Jazz Bass 5, which is listed for $759.99, an artificially low closeout price, and is already permanently out of stock. Oh, and I already bought one of those and ended up returning it because it had so many issues. That bass aside, the cheapest Fender 5-string is a whopping $1,209.99, more than double the price of the Squier. I'm going to come back to that Player Plus a few times in this review though, because I specifically want to know if the Squier fixes those problems I had with the Fender, which was about $1,000 when I bought it. Let's go. The 100-point review. Thanks for bearing with me or for just skipping to this point in the video. Now let's really see what the Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5 is all about. It's time to get quantitative. Again, here are my 10 criteria, each worth up to 10 points. Design, neck, nut, bridge, hardware, cavities, electronics, pickups, action, and sound. There are also up to 10 extra credit points, 2 to 5 points for an included gig bag, 2 points for shipping with flat wounds or stock rounds that I want to keep, and 1 to 3 je ne sais quoi points. Design. It's a jazz bass, probably the most common and influential bass design ever. To me, the true classic jazz bass design includes the visual upgrades that come with block inlays and neck binding. Most current jazz bass designs from both Fender and Squier cut that corner. Even the so-called American Ultra 2 omits the block inlays. I really don't get that. The inlays and binding are usually accompanied by a rosewood or other dark wood fretboard though. Maple fretboards with block inlays are an odd beast. My old Squier Vintage Modified had a maple fretboard with block inlays, but the blocks and binding were black. They stood out more visually, but it's definitely a different look. Also, I'm fairly sure the blocks were just black rectangles painted on, not true inlays. This bass has true pearloid block inlays and cream binding. Even if they're barely visible from a distance, it's a nice attention to detail and makes this bass look like something special. I do kind of wish the pickguard was something other than parchment, which I find a bit boring, but at least it's not pure white. I'm reluctant to give this design a 10 because it's nothing revolutionary, but I really do appreciate those extra details, so I'm going to give it a 9. Neck. I've already talked about the thing I don't like about this neck. This applies across the board for me with Squier Classic Vibe. I feel like Fender is deliberately holding these instruments back with the gloss finish on the neck because they know it's enough, all on its own, to push people like me into Fender territory for instruments with fewer features and which honestly probably cost them less to manufacture, but that they can sell for hundreds of extra dollars just for that name on the headstock. The neck is more than just finish though, especially on a 5-string. For a player with smaller hands like me, the shape of the neck and the width at the nut really make a big difference. The neck on this bass is very slim and feels great to me. It's easy to reach the low B string. The Fender website says it has a 47.6mm nut width. That's 1 7/8 inches for my fellow Americans. But I measured, and unless my tape measure is seriously off, it's actually 46mm, 1 13/16 inches. I still prefer a slightly narrower nut width, but it still feels pretty manageable for me to play. The fretboard has nicely rolled edges, and of course the gloss finish carries over seamlessly, so it feels comfortable to play. At least as comfortable as a gloss neck can. It's hard to explain, but this gloss doesn't feel super glossy to me. I've had so-called satin necks that feel totally unfinished, like the Yamaha BB435. And then there's the poly satin finish on the Fender Player Jaguar neck I have on my Frankenbass, my favorite neck ever, that actually does feel slightly glossy. The neck on this bass is definitely glossier than that, but it's not the kind of high gloss that grips my sweaty hands and makes it difficult to move around the neck. Lastly, of course, there are the frets themselves. I'm sad to say there's a slight amount of fret sprout on a few of the frets, especially near the high end of the fretboard. It's very slight and doesn't feel uncomfortable to play on. Let's put it this way. If it's down to the glossy neck, but rolled fretboard and ever so slightly rough fret edges on this neck, versus the satin finish, sharp-edged fretboard, and bumpy semi-hemispherical frets of the Sadowski Metro Express, it's no comparison. The Squier neck is way better. I wouldn't have thought I could possibly give a glossy neck anything higher than a 7, but I'm going to give this one an 8. Nut. The nut was one of the reasons I returned the Fender Player Plus. It looked like it was actually made out of wood that had just been sloppily painted white on the front edge. But whatever it was made of, it was also cut really poorly. The slots for the outer strings were so close to the edges that I had to be extremely careful not to let the strings bend over the edge of the fretboard while I was playing. Looking closely at this nut, I wish the edges were rounded off slightly, and it also looks like the B string in particular might be too close to the edge. The nut also doesn't completely fit the slot. There's a really small gap on the headstock side. That doesn't seem to affect anything, it's just something I haven't noticed on other basses. Fortunately, when I actually play the bass, those concerns go away. I have no issues with the strings going over the edges, and the most important thing about the nut, the depth of the string slots, is perfect. No real complaints here, and the nut does at least look like it's made from natural bone, as advertised. Still, I can't forget how much better a nut design could be. Thinking here of the adjustable nut on the Sadowski, so I'm going to give it a 7. Bridge. The bridge was the other reason I returned the Fender Player Plus. It had a standard Fender-style high-mass bridge, but weirdly, the hole for the B string was not big enough to accommodate the silk windings on the 130-gauge Ernie Ball flat wound string I wanted to install. I had to cut off the silk to force the string through the hole. The bridge on this bass is missing the word Fender stamped in thick block letters, but it appears to be otherwise identical to the Fender high-mass bridge, the kind that comes standard on the American Ultra and certain other models, or which you can buy as an upgrade, $84 for 4-string and $95 for 5-string. The big question is, can it accommodate a silk-wrapped flat-wound B string? Well, I'll admit this isn't a fair comparison because, much to my surprise, I actually decided to keep the stock rounds on this bass. I usually hate the feel of round-wound strings, but these are just working for me. Oh, and the stock B is a 130. No silk, though. There are much better third-party bridge designs out there now, but the Fender-style high-mass is still a nice upgrade, with improved saddles and slots to keep them aligned. And since it actually accommodates a 130-gauge B string, unlike the Fender Player Plus, I'll give it an 8. Hardware. When I talk about hardware, I'm referring to everything I don't cover elsewhere, which is generally the tuners, the knobs, and the strap buttons. These are the places where a lot of low-end instruments really cheap out. But does Squier? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The tuners on this bass have a nice-looking nickel finish. It just feels a bit higher-end than chrome. As for their function, well, they turn pretty smoothly, although I've noticed the D-string tuner sometimes doesn't really do much without a few turns. So they're not the greatest tuners, but they're not terrible. The knobs are what you'd expect on a jazz bass, black plastic. They feel okay to turn, although if I look closely I notice they're slightly askew, again something very common at this end of the market. The stack knobs turn smoothly, but turning the top one sometimes also drags the bottom one along with it. I really hate stacked knobs, but what are you going to do? The strap buttons are great. I never really gave strap buttons much thought until I felt the ones on the Glary and Harley Benton basses I tried recently. Those things feel cheap. These buttons feel nice, and I have absolutely no concerns that they're going to work loose. Overall, the hardware is about what I'd expect. I'll give it a 7. Cavities. Unlike most Fender and Squier instruments, this is an active bass, so it has a rear cavity for the battery. Sadly, the battery compartment has a screw-on cover. That would be a deal breaker for me if this bass didn't also have an active-passive toggle switch. As it is, I'm fine with it. The back of the cover has shielding on it, although interestingly, the compartment itself does not have any shielding. Here, I have to think again about the Sadowski Metro Express. That bass had a very large back cavity, which accessed not just the battery, but all of the electronics. The cavity was fully shielded with copper foil, but the large plastic snap-on cover had no shielding. I had that bass at a rehearsal, and suddenly a bunch of squawking came blasting through my amp. Interference from my phone in my pocket that was transferring right through that plastic cover. This has never happened to me with any other bass. At this point, I haven't had this bass at a rehearsal yet, although I suspect it won't be an issue. The shielding on the cover doesn't create a Faraday cage, but it probably doesn't matter because the battery is in a small, isolated compartment by itself. The rest of the electronics are accessed on the front, under the metal control plate, as is typical for a jazz bass. The front cavity is fully coated with conductive shielding paint. That, combined with the noiseless pickups, should keep the sound clean. The only criticism I have about the cavity on this bass is really more to do with the electronics, so I'll get into that in the next section. For the cavities themselves, I'm going to give this bass an 8. Electronics. Since I review the pickups separately, here I'm referring to the potentiometers, active electronics, and associated wiring. The controls on this bass consist of master volume, blend with center detent, passive tone, and stacked active treble and bass boost, plus a mini active-passive toggle switch. It's powered by a 9-volt preamp with a single battery in the rear compartment. I'm not really into active electronics that much, but this is the exact setup I want. Ideally, we'd not have the stacked knob, but you take what you get. For me, any bass with active electronics must have a passive mode switch. That truly is a deal breaker. Here, everything works as expected. The stacked knobs are quite tall, which I find annoying, but I have no complaints about their actual function. You don't get a radical amount of tone shaping with a 9-volt preamp, but the controls do make a noticeable difference and are definitely nice to have, especially in helping to give the B string a bit more definition than you typically get with a passive 5-string. My only real complaint, and it's more of a curiosity than a complaint, is what I found inside the cavity. Each of the potentiometers has a stack of washers on it. I mean, seriously, like 10 washers on each one. Why? I guess the shafts are really long, but still, why? It's just weird, and it makes the cavity really cramped, especially since there are already so many wires plus the circuit board all crammed in there. But unless you're like me, taking things apart the instant you have them out of the box, this is not something you'd ever even know about. So just forget it. I'll give the electronics a 9. Pickups. I rarely keep the stock pickups in a jazz bass, because I rarely get a jazz bass with noiseless pickups. The one jazz bass I've owned before that came with noiseless pickups, the Fender American Ultra, had such bland and nondescript pickups that it didn't even sound like a jazz bass. I'm pleased to say that not only are these pickups noiseless, as advertised, but they actually sound like jazz bass pickups. You get the distinctive snarl of the bridge pickup when soloed, a nice Geddy Lee-style bite with both pickups together, and a decently punchy quasi-P-bass sound from the neck pickup, without it being overwhelmingly louder than the bridge pickup, which has been an issue on just about every other J-style 5-string I've tried recently. The only thing I don't like about these pickups is the color of the covers. Black pickups are boring. At some point, I might swap on different covers, maybe if I also swap the knobs, but I'm not in a rush right now. As for their sound, why would I bother with anything else? 10 out of 10. Action. In some cases, I review the action as it came directly out of the box, and in some cases, I give the instrument the benefit of the doubt and do a bit of setup. If I had to radically alter the instrument just to make it playable, like with the Glary, then it deserves an out-of-the-box review. That's not the case here. I like my action as low as possible, but without fret buzz. It's a tough balance to strike between truss rod and bridge saddle adjustments. Cheaper instruments like this often arrive without a lot of care given to the final setup, and may need significant adjustments to be playable. I found as I tried out this bass that there was some noticeable buzz, especially on the middle strings around the 5th fret. Not really any buzz higher up around the 12th fret. That said to me that the solution would be a truss rod adjustment. The bridge saddles seemed to be set pretty well. I looked down the length of the neck and noticed that it was pretty much straight as an arrow. Not convex, thankfully, but there was absolutely no relief. So it was not surprising that the truss rod might need a tweak. As usual, I had to Google which direction to turn the truss rod. To add curvature to the neck, you need to turn counterclockwise. The truss rod axis on this bass is at the headstock, typical for Squier and low-end Fenders. This being a 5-string, the truss rod axis is exactly behind the A string, which is a bit annoying. I had to loosen the A string and pop it out of its string tree to really be able to do anything. A couple of extremely small turns, maybe a quarter of a rotation in total, was all it took. The fret buzz went almost completely away, without enough of a change to significantly affect the action higher up on the neck. Nothing, still, compares to the perfect action I have on my Frankenbass with that amazing Fender Player Jaguar neck. But this is very close. I honestly can't imagine it being any better on a 5-string. My heart wants to give it a 10, but my brain is saying I should give it a 9. Sound. It sounds like a jazz bass, but with no single coil hum. Fender and Squier 5-strings are notorious for having a muddy B string, and this is a big reason why higher-end 5-strings like Dingwall, Warwick, or Spectre typically either have fanned frets or a 35-inch scale. A longer B string requires higher tension and therefore has more definition. But, as I said, I have small hands. A 34-inch scale is long enough for me. Here I want to talk specifically about the Yamaha BB435, which had a special bridge design for extending the B string. That wasn't enough. The complete package matters here. I didn't like the Yamaha's pickups, which sounded dark and muddy no matter what I did. The Squier brings it all together in a way that really surpasses what you'd expect at this price point, or even as I found in my recent explorations, at double the price point. Sure, there are higher-end basses that sound amazing in ways that this one never will, so I can't give it a 10. But it's everything I wanted it to be. 9 points. Final score. Let's tally things up so far. Design, 9. Neck, 8. Nut, 7. Bridge, 8. Hardware, 7. Cavities, 8. Electronics, 9. Pickups, 10. Action, 9. Sound, 9. Total, 84. But we've got some extra credit points to consider. Gig bag? Of course, it does not come with one. 0 points. Flats? Nope. But since I actually surprisingly like the stock rounds, I'm giving it the 2 points. They sound great, and they don't feel nearly as annoying to me as most rounds do, which is the main reason why I play flats in the first place. Je ne sais quoi? I've got to give it 1 extra point for having a glossy neck that I don't hate to touch. Yes, you can tell I have some sensory issues. Anyway, that's 3 extra credit points, bringing us to a grand total of 87 points out of 100. Let's see how that fares on my price to score matrix. The price to score matrix. When I bought it, I managed to squeak by before the tariff-related price increase at $530. But even after the increase, it's still in the same bracket, now at $557. For this price, I wanted to score at least an 86, and it beat that by 1.
Nailed it.
I'm pleased to say that I think I've finally found a 5-string bass I can live with. And funnily enough, it's essentially the successor to the last 5-string bass I was actually happy with, also a Squier. Final thoughts. I know there are a lot of people who dismiss Fender as overpriced crap. And there are people even amongst the Fender fanatics who dismiss Squier as cheap crap. But Squier is no longer the bottom of the ladder as far as cheap instruments go, thanks to the likes of Harley Benton, Glary, and all of the other no-name instruments showing up these days on Amazon. Even Squier has its own special bottom-end line, the Debut series, which, as far as I know, is only available on Amazon. It's not even mentioned on Fender's own website. But Squier really seems to have something special going with the Classic Vibe series. Guitar and bass manufacturing in Indonesia is in kind of a golden era. Prices are still very reasonable compared to instruments made in Japan, Mexico, or the United States, but the quality is high and quality control constantly improving. This is a golden age for Squier, and I think people are beginning to take notice. In that context, the Squier Classic Vibe 70s Active Jazz Bass 5, besides being a mouthful of a product name, is another outstanding offering. No, I'm not getting paid to say this. I bought this instrument with my own money. This is just my own personal story of the journey to find a decent 5-string bass for myself. And I think I found it. Is this the end of my bass unboxing and review videos? Honestly, it probably should be, unless those vendors start sending me free gear to demo. Don't hold your breath waiting for that to happen. But as a teaser, I just want to let you know I definitely have at least 1 more new bass coming. I won't say what it is, but here's a hint. I had to pre-order it back in May. As always, if you made it this far, what's the matter with you? But seriously, I do appreciate your support. Please like and subscribe, and check out other ways to support the channel in the description. Thanks for watching. Oh wait, it's not over. You probably want to hear more of this bass in action. Here's the first part of track 2 from my upcoming Suspension of Disbelief prog rock album. Track 2 is called The Unexamined Life. The second part of it is inspired by Gentle Giant, but the first part, which you're about to hear, is inspired by Fish. It's called Bullsh Detector.